Well, we've done Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, so I suppose it's only appropriate that we go over the jobs of Final Fantasy Tactics A2, Grimoire of the Rift. My name is Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman, and welcome back to the channel. Hello everyone, if you enjoy what I do, including my coverage of tier lists or just discussing jobs in general for turn-based strategy RPGs, much like the Final Fantasy Tactics series, then a like on this video and a subscription to the channel, as well as considering checking out my Patreon and my YouTube memberships would be very much appreciated. Thank you so much. So yes, as mentioned, we've discussed the Final Fantasy Tactics jobs, we've discussed the Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced jobs, and while many of the jobs in A2 are similar, if not identical, to the jobs in A1, there's plenty of differences, plenty of new jobs, and new interactions between different job abilities, or even changes in role or abilities or nerfs or buffs to existing jobs, so it's worth going through and talking about A2 as well. Now, notably, as you can see, there are a lot of jobs here, okay? And it's been quite a while since I played A2, so two things to note. First of all, we're not going to be talking about the unique jobs here because, frankly, they're kind of boring and pretty weak for the most part, which makes them not very fun to discuss. They're also only usable by the characters that are, able to use them, which means build crafting isn't really as much of a thing, so we're not going to be talking about that. Also, since it has been a very long time since I played A2 through from beginning to end, a little bit of my remembrance of these jobs and their abilities is going to be a little shaky, so please forgive me if there's some edge case or weird combo of abilities that I don't remember that winds up causing a change in a job's placement in the tier list. That said, I've gone through and refreshed myself on all of the jobs by reading through the wiki. I do have the wiki open here so that if there's any specific details I need to look up, I can do that. But overall, I think I've got a decent grasp on things at this point. I've even played a little bit of the game. My DS is over there charging. But just to refresh myself a little bit, because I do still have the physical cartridge. So, that said, there's a lot of jobs here. We're going to get right into it and try to punch through as quickly as we can, starting, as always, with the Hume jobs with Soldier. Now, while in FFTA, Soldier had a bit more of a role as one of the tankier jobs that had some decent battlefield versatility going on, there's less room for that in A2. Tactics Advance let every job shine in some capacity, but A2 has advanced jobs and combos that are just so disgustingly powerful that more basic setups like Soldier just really fall by the wayside. I don't think it's a terrible choice, but it's certainly not going to be something that you're going to want to be using through to the end game like you could potentially in Tactics Advance, and that means it's going to go solidly in C tier. Its role hasn't really changed. It's basically an amalgamation of Squire and Knight from FFT with some break skills, some ability to remove basic status effects, do some healing. You can still provoke with it. It's tanky. It's got good HP, good defense, sure. But it's certainly not something that you're going to want to be carrying into even probably the mid game, let alone the late game. Now, Archer for Humes is largely the same as well, and we're going to put that in C tier as well. Is it a bad job, like for some mechanical reason? No, not at all. But it's not something that you're really going to want to be spending more time in than you have to, and the abilities that it brings to the table are largely overshadowed by either other Hume jobs or the jobs of other races that can just do what it does, but better. It gives you some early ranged physical damage, it gives you some early status effects and other fun stuff like that, but it's very quickly going to fall by the wayside, even more than it already did in FFTA. Now, Thief is an interesting one. Thief I rated pretty lowly in my FFTA tier list, but here it's going to be better. And the main reason for that is because of the Bazaar system. If you don't know, in FFTA 2, the primary way that you get new equipment and as such new abilities, because you learn abilities from your gear in the advanced tactics games, is by going to the bazaar and turning in random like ores, minerals, monster parts, whatever, to craft new gear that you then buy. And the main way, well, one of the main ways to get some good high quality stuff early and just find rare loot in general is by using a thief to steal it from enemies. So thief is actually very important here. It's still not a great combat class, but it's a very solid option for being able to get your hands on the pieces that you need to actually keep learning abilities with your characters, and as such, it kind of becomes a meta support class for the party as a whole. Like, yeah, in FFTA, it was one thing to be able to, like, just steal good gear off of enemies that could teach you new abilities, whatever, but you would be able to find that gear pretty easily as you progress through the game for the most part, so it wasn't as useful. But now, with Thief in FFTA 2 with the Bazaar system, you really need to be finding as many different components as possible to try and craft good gear, whether it be statistically good or gear that's going to just give you abilities as early as possible. Because there's really nothing that sucks more than having a job that you like for a character and then feeling like you're missing out on progression because you just aren't getting the pieces that you need to craft new gear for them, so they're not learning abilities in that current job, leading you to want to like change to a different job, but that job might not have the stats that you want or the battlefield role that you want. So it can kind of feel sometimes like a character's just stagnating in a way that you don't really like. So I really like Thief in FFTA 2 far more than in FFTA, and I'm more likely to field them on a regular basis and more likely to try and steal stuff with them as well. That's something we'll see with Moogle too. White Mage is kind of awkward. White Mage falls into the awkward position where they don't have some of their kit that they used to have because that got transferred to the Vieira's Green Mage. So Hume White Mage, I'm going to put solidly in C tier as well. It's mainly just a healing class at this point, like a healing and resurrection class. And it's just rough, man. Like, you have so many different ways of restoring HP. You have so many different ways of getting characters back on their feet. There's so many jobs that do it better. It really does feel like more of a starter class in A2 compared to A1 or FFT in general. So there's just other jobs that do its role better, and that means that while it's not a bad job, mechanically speaking, it's really not going to be something that you bring into the end game. Now, Black Mage, on the other hand, is still a very strong option. It's going to be our first A-tier job. Black Mage is always good as just your archetypical ranged magical damage dealer, right? You've got all the array of basic elemental skills, you've got geomancy, and that's all you need to really make a very capable damage dealer. Combine that with the fact that it actually does have solid growths for magic classes, whether it be staying in Black Mage or going to other jobs. And that just means that it's going to be a solid choice from the beginning to the end of the game. Like, you would truly be happy if you had a character that started off as a Black Mage, leveled as Black Mage, learned all the job skills, went to some other jobs to maybe get some support abilities, a good secondary skill set, whatever, and then go back to Black Mage and just coast on that through the rest of the game. That would not be a bad thing at all, and I think that means that it secures a pretty high spot. Is it the best that Humes have on offer? Absolutely not. Is it the best job in the game? Absolutely not. But you don't feel bad taking one compared to a lot of the other early Hume jobs. Now, Fighter. This is one that has always made me sad, because Fighter is probably my favorite job in FFTA. It's extremely strong. It's a great physical damage dealer. It's not the tankiest, but it's not like fragile either. It's just a very strong all-around frontline fighter. No pun intended. But in A2, it loses some of that capability due to some of the other insane jobs that you get further down the line. Is it bad? No. And I think we're going to put it in B tier, which is definitely lower than where I had it on my TA tier list. But yeah, it loses some capability. While it still has all of its versatility, it doesn't hit quite the same ceiling that other jobs do in FFTA 2. Otherwise, it functions exactly as you would expect. You have Air Render for range, you've got Aura Blast for AoE range, you've got Backdraft for powerful melee with Fire Element, you've got Beatdown if you want to roll the dice on accuracy. Like, it is a physical damage dealer through and through, and it's never going to hurt. But if you're looking to deal damage in melee especially, there's better options now. Now, Hume Illusionist specifically is an interesting one, and this is going to be something that kind of gets discussed similarly to the way that it did in Tactics Advance, due to other jobs and other races having the ability to access Illusionist. Hume Illusionist is not really the way that you want to go if you're trying to deal damage to a bunch of enemies with Humes. Now, that said, I know a lot of you are screaming. You can see the other job right here that pairs with it is Seer. Well, but Tom, what about like illusion magic with Seer? You can deal a ton of damage to everything on the board. And that's true. For something that we'll talk about with Seer in a second here, it has an ability that lets you chain a lot of damage on every enemy on the board. And that's really good. The issue is that that's not the benefit of the illusionist. Like, the illusionist isn't what's allowing you to really do that any more than it was allowing you to do some damage to enemies on the board in Tactics Advance. It's the Seer's ability that allows you to really start stacking that damage. So you can't really attribute that to illusionist. As so, I think it's a very middle-of-the-road job. It's certainly not bad, especially if you can get a bunch of enemies on the board that all have the same elemental weakness. You can start really chipping away at them. But, you know, with issues with MP restoration and just the overall kind of slowness of the job, it's not great. I think it sits solidly at B tier. It's not terrible, but it's not great either. Now, Seer. Seer is going to be our first S tier class. Easily. So the reason that Seer is so good is twofold. First of all, it has Recharge, which just allows you to start stacking MP on itself and potentially on other characters as well. And in a system where regenerating MP from 0 from the beginning of the battle is so important to be able to cast your big spells and abilities, that's obviously very important. Being able to get some MP restoration going early is huge. Then you have Magic Frenzy. So Magic Frenzy is an insane ability where when you use it on a target, you not only use a spell on them, whatever spell that you want basically, but you also hit them with a physical attack in the process. So you have this sort of like mixed physical magical damage dealer. I would say Spellblade normally, but that's an actual job in A2, so I don't want to go that far. But it's very strong and it stacks very well with other abilities. Take, for example, Illusionist that we were just talking about. If you use an illusion spell with Magic Frenzy, not only do you hit every enemy on the board with an illusion spell, which deals low-ish damage, but still respectable, especially if you have a good magic stat, you also hit every enemy on the board with a physical attack. Now, if you have two weapons, because you're dual wielding, and then you use an illusion spell with Magic Frenzy, you hit every enemy on the board with an illusion spell, and then hit every enemy on the board twice with physical attacks. So now you can see how the damage is really going to start stacking up here. You use this on a major physical damage dealer, like a Ninja or a Paravir. You don't even worry about the magic damage. You just go for the double physical hit on everything on the board with a little bit of extra magic damage as a bonus, and you're chunking the entire enemy army. It's so insane. Combine that with the fact that Seer can, at baseline, use pretty much all of the standard mid-tier magic like Cura, Fyra, Blizzara, Thundara, etc., and you have a fairly versatile job, even though its stats aren't great. It's kind of sort of filling a role of the calculator job from FFT, something that we're going to see with a few of these jobs going forward. But really what you're in it for is that Recharge and the Magic Frenzy, which is disgusting, and those two abilities alone make it worth running. Next up, we have Paladin, and Paladin I do think is still solid, but I don't think it's as good as it was in FFTA, much like Fighter. Its role is largely unchanged, a defensive frontline fighter slash tank that has some damage options with things like Holy Blade and Saint Cross, but generally it's there to soak hits and oftentimes learn chivalry abilities to then put on another job to give them some defensive options so they don't just explode if they get targeted. Is it a bad choice? No, definitely not. It's a very strong defensive fighter, but compared to some of the other options that you have for either huge single target damage or, as we just discussed with Seer, insane, like enemy party wide AoE damage, does not quite have the chops that it used to. Now, Ninja, on the other hand, is still an A-tier job. Just the fact that you're able to get dual wield off of it, which is able to enable things like the Magic Frenzy Insanity that we were just talking about, or even just having high move, high speed, good physical damage, and two swords to run up behind something and slap the crap out of it, is very, very good. It's not going to be the pinnacle of single target damage. That's coming up here in a few entries, but it's still a very strong option, and I would not blame someone who decides to run a Ninja from the time they unlock it through to the end of the game. You'll have good stats, you'll have good versatility, you have the throw option for range damage, you still have your little ninja spells, even though they kind of suck still, but like you can get some status effects in there. It's the physical damage that you're really looking for, and Ninja still delivers on that front. Hunter. Hunter is interesting. Again, I think like some of the other OG FFTA jobs. It falls off a little bit here with A2. And this is going to be something that we kind of see with the Gria version of the job as well. But it has its benefits. Having a bow is nice. Being able to do certain things to cripple the enemy is nice. Having good monster slaying and the ability to get extra loot from slaying things is definitely good, don't get me wrong. But I don't think that really elevates it any higher than Thief, if we're being realistic. Like, you have better ranged physical damage options. You have equivalent ways of getting extra loot. It's fine, but it's never been a job that I really feel like I need to be focusing on for a character. Now, Blue Mage, I think, is a lot better than I gave it credit for in FFTA. I'm not going to say it's necessarily A tier, as you still have to jump through a lot of hoops to get it leveled up and get the actual abilities on it that you want, but you have a greater variety of monster abilities to learn in A2, and combining that with things like, again, Magic Frenzy can be very beneficial for the job as a whole. I can't put too much credit to Blue Mage for a seer ability, but it does feel like it has an overall greater level of versatility due to some of the abilities it can learn from other jobs, and the fact that monster abilities tend to be easier to track down to learn, and also have feels like a little bit more potency than they did in FFTA. So I think that bumps the job up a tier. Now, Paravir, if anyone who knows FFTA2 is watching this, and I bet that is a fair amount of you, you should not be surprised when I put this in S tier as well. When I was talking about good single target damage, in fact, great single target damage over some other jobs that Hume, or just the game in general, has access to, Paravir is one of the ones that I'm thinking of. Their blade skills that deal double the damage of a normal physical attack, while also having the gamut of elemental resistances that they can target, or elemental weaknesses, I should say, to deal bonus damage that way, and then also being able to combine that with the Geomancy skill from Black Mage to turn enemy neutrality into a weakness to an element, things like that, means that their potential damage output is insane. They're great single-target duelists. They don't have a lot of defensive options, but they are able to delete targets that you need them to delete, and then if it looks like that they're going to die in any sort of capacity, you can just use their Unburdened Soul ability to heal the whole party to full. Like, it's just an insane job. It is one of the #1 ways to deal extremely strong damage with Hume characters, and I would be remiss to put it anywhere other than S tier. Now, moving on to New Mu, this is where things are going to get a little interesting because they have some overlap in their abilities. Beastmaster still sucks. Unfortunately, it actually kind of sucks more than it did in FFTA, because now when you try to take control of a beast to use its abilities with Beastmaster, while you do get the ability to use the monster's turn immediately, you only get that ability for the one turn, and you can't even move the monster. So if it's something that is like has abilities that require it to be adjacent to a target to be able to hit anything, and it's not adjacent to a target to be able to hit anything, then you're just SOL, and you can't do anything. You're wholly reliant on what monsters are on the battlefield. Most of the time, their abilities aren't going to be that impactful to use anyway, especially compared to some of the abilities and spells that you could be using on a new move with a different job. The fact that, like, the only damage that it really has that's reliable is running up and hitting things with the instruments. It's just like, get it out of here, man. I don't want it. It had more versatility in TA when you could at least move the monster around, put it in strategic positions, run it away from your party if nothing else, if it's a dangerous creature. You can't even do that here. It's a shame, but Beastmaster is an absolute dud for me. Now, New Mu Black Mage, much like Hume Black Mage, is going to reside in A tier. As always, New Mu Black Mages, I think, get a little bit more credit than Hume Black Mages, just because the race is more adept with magic, is generally going to be more powerful than them. But the overall role of the job is exactly the same between the two. It's not really getting any major benefits that I can think of from the other New Mu jobs compared to Black Mage and the Hume jobs. So it's just a good damage dealing job. I think you're happy to have a character using it. White Mage, again, it's going to be the same thing. You don't really see major differences with the New Mu version of White Mage compared to the Hume White Mage. It had some of its abilities taken away to make Green Mage feel a little bit more special. It's not bad to have, but there's also other options for restoring health. I think it resides solidly in C tier. Time Mage is, I think, a B tier class for Numu. It is still really nice being able to use haste on your allies, slow your enemies, potentially stop things, quicken things, drop meteors on things if you want to. But kind of like these other sort of mid-tier Hume jobs that are in B tier, Time Mage loses a little bit of its credibility, I guess you could say, its capability, due to how good some other Numu jobs have gotten, either because of things that they got as buffs from FFTA to A2, or the new jobs that are on offer as well. You don't feel bad having a Time Mage, but losing the ability to hit multiple allies with haste, for example, compared to the regular FFT Time Mage, means it's just not going to be as strong as you might like it to be. Alchemist. Alchemist is an S tier job. Alchemist is really, really good in FFTA, and I think it's just as good, if not better, here. Even though the Alchemist skill set is not always going to be the most useful, with things like Astra and Rasp having more limited use cases, I would say, than some other spells. The fact that you have Proto Meteor for good like single target or AoE damage at range, the fact that you always have the items ability on hand when you're using Alchemist, and the fact that it has really good stats means that it's oftentimes going to wind up being the sort of landing place for general caster Numu types. Combine that with the fact that the alchemy skill does also give you some good versatility in terms of what you're able to do with non-direct damaging spells. You can slap on something like Black Magic or Sagacity or whatever, Illusion Magic if you want. Have that damage option available, have the utility of Alchemist available, and also have items available, which could be great if you just need some focused, targeted healing, resurrection, etc. It's a very, very nice job, and I think most Numu are happy to be here or wind up here at some point in the game, even if you don't wind up using it all the way through as a dedicated job, which I think you probably should be. Then we have Scholar, and this is one that I need to reference a little bit because I'm not super familiar with it. It's kind of like Illusionist, but instead of hitting every enemy on the board, it hits everything on the board, period. And that might initially seem like a bad thing, but one thing that I always remember doing with Scholar was having elemental absorption gear, or at least resistance gear, on the rest of my party, and then spamming whatever spell it was that they had that targeted that element. So one thing I remember doing is using things like Rime Bolt Tome to hit everything on the board with ice damage, and generally from what I remember being a little bit stronger than Illusionist was, but the benefit was then I could have ice shields on my entire party, and they would actually absorb that damage, so my entire party would get healed, and the entire enemy party would take damage. This is again very reminiscent of the Calculator class as it exists in FFT, where you're able to kind of set things up to heal your whole party and hurt the whole enemy party with one action, which can obviously be insanely strong. Now, Scholar is interesting because it doesn't have access to every element in the game. You have Earth, Ice, Thunder, and Dark, and then some other options like the ability to raise resilience or put a random buff on an ally, which can be fun, but obviously might not be super relevant depending on what you roll. And then the ability to see what loot and items an enemy is carrying, which, if you're trying to farm specific crafting at the bazaar, can be useful if niche. So overall, I think Scholar is a solid middle-of-the-road job. It's not going to be something that you're going to be dealing maximum damage with, and it does require a lot of building around, but if you do build around it, it can be useful. Now, Illusionist, I think Numu Illusionist is going to go up one tier to A. Just the fact that Numu have better MP and magic than Hume Illusionists means that it's generally going to be better, and it's a strong job in general. Having a Numu that chills in the back and just spams illusion magic, maybe with something that's restoring their MP, can chunk down certain enemies in the enemy formation very, very quickly, especially if you're hitting their elemental weaknesses. So it's definitely an option that I like. Oftentimes I'll wind up with illusion magic on my Alchemist when I wind up having a Numu finally switch to Alchemist for their final job. It just feels like a very solid option. Now we have Arcanist, and Arcanist is one that I wish was better than it is. Arcanist is kind of like a weird mix of Black Mage and Illusionist, or Black Mage and Scholar, wherein a lot of its skills are going to be hitting everything or a large number of things. So essentially, this is your Dark and Gravity Magic job. You're able to use the Gravity and Graviga spells. You're able to use things like level 3 and level 5 and level unknown Shadow Flare, which are going to deal dark damage to enemies of various different types. So like level 3 is like divisible by 3, level 5 is divisible by 5. And then level unknown is any enemy that matches the first digit of the level of the Arcanist. And these do deal good damage. Combine that with the fact that you have things like instant death spells or drain, and you have some interesting options here. The issue is that you're very reliant either on RNG or what types of enemies or what level of enemies you're fighting. If you don't have a level of enemies that is convenient for you to target with your Shadow Flare skills, then they're going to be useless. If you just don't roll well on trying to cast Gravity or Graviga to cut enemy HP by a quarter or a half, then you're just going to miss and you're going to waste your turn and your MP. And while Drain is a nice ability that's going to allow you to deal good damage while also restoring your own HP, most new move classes aren't tanky enough or durable enough to really make that worth it in the first place. The only one that I can really think of is the last one we're going to talk about here, Sage. And while it can make good use of Drain, it's not going to be the best use of that job's time and MP. So as much as I love Arcanist and think it's a very, very cool job, I don't think it has a great place in this list of jobs. Finally, we have Sage, and Sage is going to be another S tier job for New Mu. The thing about Sage is it continues to be one of the best, if not the best, melee fighters for New Mu with a shield and a mace, while also having very solid stat growth across the board and access to a wide variety of different skill types through the Sagacity skill, to say nothing of whatever else you can equip them with from other jobs. This means that it's a great all-rounder job for what is otherwise a fairly specialized race, with abilities like Scathe that can deal massive damage in a line, or wind magic, or water magic, or other options for just dealing weird esoteric damage types while also being able to fight in melee, is great. I love Sage, it's durable, it's got the physical damage, it's got the magical damage, and it's one of the better platforms for all of the various different New Mu jobs that you can unlock, which means it's a very strong option for the race. Now moving on to Banga. Banga are kind of in a rough position in A2 because a lot of their role as the big burly physical race gets taken by the Seek and the Gria, who we're going to talk about at the end here, which is really kind of a shame because I loved that role that Banga had in FFTA. And while there's still no slouches, they kind of wind up with a little bit more of a support tricky role with their new jobs that doesn't really suit them all that well. So Warrior is going to go right into C tier. Much like Soldier, it's pretty much unchanged from FFTA, and it's definitely more of a starter job than it ever was before. I don't recommend people use Warrior beyond getting the job skills that you want from it, and then switching off of it and never looking at it again. White Monk, while I did rate it higher in FFTA, if I remember correctly, I think it's just solidly B tier. It's got more versatility and more staying power than something like, say, Warrior, with its ability to restore HP, revive allies, deal damage at range, and different types of like targeting patterns, being generally durable, having good physical attack. It's a good all-rounder, but I mean, just the fact that it has an advanced class now in Master Monk tells you pretty much everything that you need to know about what the intended role and rank of this job is. Defender is also going to be a very solid B tier job with the prevalence of AoE abilities, magical abilities, a greater amount of destructive potential on the battlefield with less dueling. You will kind of wind up in a situation where dedicated dueling type jobs that are defensive in nature just don't really have the same role that they might have before. Like, sure, it's still great being able to put like an auto revive and regen on yourself and everything, but it costs a bunch of MP for one. And like, if something's dealing that much damage to your defender that early, your defender's probably not long for this world, whether they get downed and revive themselves or not, right? So, unfortunately, I think this job does lose a rank or two from FFTA, which is a shame because I love it. Dragoon is another middle-of-the-road job, and I think we're going to be seeing a lot of these as I look at the rest of the list here with Banga. It was better in FFTA, but the breath attacks are less impactful than they used to be, especially with the fact that you have a wider range of elemental weaknesses and resistances than you really tended to see on the battlefield in FFTA. Its jump skill, its worm, drain ability, they're fine. They're fine, but it's not a job that I find myself happy to be in like I did in FFTA. And it's going to be the same thing for the Gladiator here, actually. Much like the Human Fighter, Gladiators just kind of fall off. They're good when you have them, but it's not a job that you really want your Banga to wind up in. And that is really not great when it is something that takes a little bit of time to unlock and does have what seems to be fairly solid abilities right off the bat, but they don't really scale well going into the latter game. Now, Cannoneers, these are interesting ones, and I'm going to put these in A tier. This might be a little bit of a contentious option, but just the insane range that Cannoneers have as one of the really only pretty strong ranged options that Banga have are definitely an interesting case. They're a blend of DPS and support type character with the ability to aid allies and hurt enemies, which is good. Can kind of lead to them feeling a little unfocused at times, but at the same time, being able to bombard enemies with cannonballs of different types from range is very, very nice. And I do think the natural physical damage of Banga can allow them to actually be fairly decent damage dealers, especially on squishy targets. Bishop, I think, is solidly C tier, unfortunately. Bishop is not, again, a bad job by any means. Having the ability to cast Cure, Arrow, Water, other various different options is very, very important for Banga that largely have no major magical options available to them. But if you're using Bishop alongside other magic users, you're clearly going to figure out very quickly that it's not going to have the same punch as some other options would. Even if you're mixing like a Black Mage and White Mage on one character, they're still probably going to outperform Bishop at most turns, and that means that it's solidly a C tier job. Moving on to Templar, and I feel like Templar is one of the Banga jobs that actually manages to hold some of its relevance from FFTA. It's still just a really nice all-rounder. It can wield Knight Swords, it can wield Spears, so it has that versatility. It still gives you time magic, it still gives you anti-magic capabilities, gives you Bone Crusher. Like, there's good options in Templar, and it has good all-around stats, giving Banga an anti-magic option that is very much appreciated. If you're going to go for a physical class or like a physical job setup for a Banga character, ending in Templar so that you have that versatility is certainly not a bad option. Like, just the ability to haste yourself and kind of help with sometimes poor speed for Banga is definitely a nice path to be able to take, and it's one of my preferred options. You know, it helps that the class looks awesome as well. So I think realistically, this is probably going to be more of an A tier job. Like, you really don't feel bad about fielding it. It can support yourself. It can support its allies. It has good damage. It's got versatile damage. I think it's a pretty solid option, all things considered. Next up, we have Master Monk, and this I think is going to be another A tier job. Kind of fulfilling the role that White Monk had as a good damage dealer. You have some nice options here because you have elemental options like Dark and Holy. It allows you to actually deal with things like Undead, have some piercing damage, some potential big damage options if you want it, and overall very good physical stats and speed. So again, if you want to wind up in a physical job option, but you want to go for more of the Monk style than maybe the Knight style, Master Monk is going to be kind of an equivalent for Templar. You're going to have a lot more damage options and far fewer defensive options, but I think that's generally okay, especially because you do get like piercing attacks and have that type of range available as well. Finally, we have Trickster, and Trickster, this is probably one of the hardest ones for me, honestly, because I really like Trickster. Just the idea of like having the throwing cards to be able to attack from an extreme range is really nice, and between that and Cannoneer, it's good to have some more like fairly solid ranged options with Banga. The weird thing is, you're doing a lot of control of status infliction with Trickster, right? And that's typically not the role that you want to be in for Banga, and they're not like the best at it either. But at the same time, being able to berserk and confuse and do other fun stuff like that can be nice while having some good, like, ranged physical damage options. So I think Trickster's going to go solidly in B tier. It's not a bad job by any means. I don't think it hurts to wind up there, but it's not going to reach the same heights as some other Banga jobs either. Moving on to the Viera, and the Viera are definitely going to be topping the charts very often, much like they were in FFTA2, partially because of blood price, something that is just absolutely insane that the devs allowed it to exist, and we will talk about that. But first, we do need to talk about Archer, and I think much like Hume Archer, it's just a solidly C-tier job. Like, it's not bad per se, but you really don't want to be in it longer than you have to be. You can make it function, especially in conjunction with other job skills that the VR have. Just having a bow to be able to utilize with some other abilities that they can use is definitely nice, don't get me wrong. But you don't want to be here for too long. You do not want to be here for too long. And it doesn't really have many benefits compared to Hume Archer, right? So we're going to move out of that fairly quickly. Fencer is one that I think can go solidly in B tier. It's really not a bad option for a melee physical damage dealer for Viera. It's one of the few options that they have, really. But having poison, having AoE damage in melee, having some ranged damage, having the ability to just kind of stand on the front line and duel is certainly not a bad option, and it's not going to be one of the most powerful options that Viera has, but it's something that has capability to be able to be used throughout the entire game. Now, Spell Sword. This is an interesting one. Spell Sword is basically Beowulf from FFT, right? Just not at range unless you're using it with a ranged weapon. Having the ability to basically, with your physical attacks, put all sorts of different status effects on enemies can be very powerful. Now, compared to some of the other options that Viera has, it's not as powerful. Compared to some of the other just pure destructive damage dealing options in the game, it's not that powerful. But for the point at which you get it, it can be pretty good, right? Now, what makes the job dumb, though, is this is where you're getting Blood Price. And Blood Price is the support ability that makes it so you use your HP instead of your MP to cast spells. It doubles the HP cost, but, like, who cares? The whole point of having MP recharge being a thing in the advanced games is to balance magic when you don't have something like the charge system from FFT, to make it take more time to get those big powerful spells out. So being able to circumnavigate that is ridiculously stupid, especially in a race that has access to, like, double cast from Red Mage. So now you can... so dumb. Now you can have Blood Price and double cast, like, summons for free, and, like, just drop a damage summon on enemies and then drop a heal summon on yourself if you're really that worried about the HP cost of using the summons. To name just one example, Blood Price Last Breath to just start insta-killing targets is another good example. Or just big single target damage with double cast Elementalist abilities. Like, it's just... it's insane. It's absolutely nuts. And while, like, I can't give the job all of the credit because it's just one part of the setup, Blood Price as a whole is still so ridiculous that I think we have to rate the job as S tier just for that ability. Even if the job as a whole is not the strongest around, just that alone is so stupid. It shouldn't exist, but it does, so there you go. Elementalist, I think, is a solid A tier job. It's not going to be the best of the best, but having the ability to fight in melee with rapiers, having the ability to inflict all sorts of different status effects, heal, deal elemental damage, it's a solid all-rounder job, and it's going to enable you to pick off vulnerable targets with relative ease. So it's not going to be something that you probably wind up staying in, but again, with stuff like Blood Price and Double Cast, Elementalist can be really nice. So, like, hey, who am I to judge? Viera White Mage is exactly like... well, no, you know what? Actually, hold on. I rescind that statement. Viera White Mage is very much like Hume White Mage and Numu White Mage, except for the one benefit that it has Blood Price. So if you want to have a really good healer, being able to cast Curaga immediately for free to heal an ally that you're standing next to, and then immediately restore the HP that you used to cast the Curaga in the first place on turn 1, and every subsequent turn after, because you don't have to worry about MP restoration, just makes the job better right off the bat. And it makes White Mage on Hume and Numu look worse by comparison. So that's the thing. Like, Viera having Blood Price kind of automatically bumps all of their magic casting jobs, or really any job that wants to use MP in general, up a tier. That's why Elementalist is an A. Elementalist would normally be B tier, but you have access to Blood Price, so all of its skills get better. Like, it's just, it's such a weird situation to be in. Sniper, I think, is a little bit less useful in A2 compared to A. Having that ranged physical damage is nice, and again, having things like Besotoxico or being able to target enemy gear or whatever, like double shot, it's good. Like, it's good ranged physical damage, but so often elemental damage or spells are the name of the game, especially by the end game in A2. So things like Sniper tend to fall off a bit more than they did in A. It's still a good job, and much like pretty much all the other jobs in B tier, like, you won't feel bad bringing it into the end game, but it's not going to hit the same as it did in A, for sure. And it's not going to stack up to other jobs in A2 either. Green Mage, I think, is going to go in C tier. The thing about Green Mage is it partially cannibalized White Mage to get Protect and Shell. And then it's kind of like Mystic from FFT, where it relies on hitting enemies with status effects. But when you have things like Spellblade that, granted, want to be in melee unless you're using a ranged weapon, you can inflict most of those same status effects while also dealing damage to the enemy. And unlike Mystics in FFT, Green Mages aren't great in physical attacking. Like, they've got hammers, which you think would hit pretty hard, but they really don't. So then just having the ability to, like, put oil on an enemy or put an enemy to sleep or whatever isn't all that awesome. Now, what they do have is the Trank skill, which is going to give, I think it's a 30% accuracy boost to whatever the next skill is that you use, which is nice, don't get me wrong, but it's not generally something that you're going to be using on Green Mage. It's more for other jobs. So, and even then, most of the time you're just going to be using it on Assassin to get near perfect accuracy last breath, which is nice, but it doesn't make the job overall as good as something like Spellblade, which is also, like, kind of just fine, but makes literally every ability that requires MP on a Viera immediately broken. So that kind of changes the tier a little bit. So Green Mage is kind of meh. Red Mage is also S tier, just like it was in FFTA. Like, just having double cast alone is nuts. Having the ability to be okay in melee with rapiers is nice. Having access to a wide array of magic to use with double cast just on its own is nice. Like, double cast is disgusting. Double cast with Blood Price is extra disgusting. Double cast with Blood Price and Summon Magic is triple disgusting. So I don't think it can go anywhere other than S tier. Assassin, I think, is solidly A tier. Again, like, it's certainly not bad. It's pretty much just as good as it is in FFTA, but the power scaling is off compared to FFTA because there's busted stuff like Blood Price double casting. So while, yes, it is nice to be able to trank yourself and then use Blood Price to, no matter how much MP you have, immediately drop pretty much any target that isn't immune to instant death effects, is very strong. But so often you're just going for, like, either specifically targeted instant elemental damage with things like Paravir, or you're going for as much AoE as possible with things like Seer and, again, like Blood Price Summoner and all that type of crap. So having a 2-turn near insta-kill is good, but it's not quite as good as other options, especially that Viera have. And then, of course, finally, we have to bring in Summoner. On its face, again, it wouldn't be as good, but being able to combo with all these other Viera abilities and then also Summon Magic, just being very good and hitting in a big area across all the elements and being able to heal and being able to give regen, like, it's just versatile, and it's got so many good support options that it really can't go anywhere other than S, in my opinion. There'd probably be some people that would try to argue it down to A, and that's fair. I think that's reasonable enough, but, like, dude, Summoner's just nuts, man. Okay, now, moving on, we have the Moogles, and unfortunately, I think even though they got some options compared to FFTA, the Moogles just compare even less favorably to some of this other busted stuff, so it's not going to be a great showing for them. Animist is easily C tier. It's still really not much better than it is in FFTA. Like, it's got all the same options. Chocobo Rush deals solid damage. You know, you can put things to sleep. Woohoo. You can like give armor with basically protect and shell using like sheep wool or whatever it is. You can get a full heal. Like, those are nice enough options, but you're typically only targeting one thing at a time. You don't really have great damage options. Your stats are not great. You're hitting things in melee with instruments. It's just very middle of the road, even when you first get the job at the beginning of the game. And from there, it's just all downhill. So it's really not a great option. Not terrible, but not great. Thief, I think, again, can reside solidly in B tier just because of how important loot is to get. And Moogle Thieves are generally going to be a little bit faster, a little bit dodgier than Human Thieves. Not enough to really change the bar of where they are in the tier list, I would say. But I think they definitely deserve to stay in B tier. Moogle Black Mages, I think they're going to drop down a tier. The issue with Moogles is their magic damage really isn't as good. And I think I made this same argument with the FFT tier list as well. Or FFTA, I should say. It's still not bad. Black Mages are still just a very solid job, but the fact that Moogles don't have as much in terms of actual stats with the job, bring it down a notch. Now, Time Mage is one where you don't have to worry about stats nearly as much, so much like Numu Time Mages, I think Moogle Time Mages reside solidly in B tier. It's just a solid support job overall, and the added speed that Moogles can have can actually make it a little bit better at times than Numu Time Mage, so not a bad option, not a bad option. Moogle Knight, I think, is going to sit solidly in B tier. Again, compared to most other physical classes, it doesn't have that much going on, but it can be durable, it can deal damage. It really doesn't have anything different going on than it did in FFTA, so we're going to glide past it pretty quick. But if you want physical melee damage with a Moogle, I mean, it's pretty much your best bet. Go for it. Flintlock. This is an interesting one, because Flintlock is kind of the ranged support version of Fusilier or Cannoneer with Banga, and it's not terrible. Mainly, you're going to be using it to prime for a turn and then give extra MP to big casters like, say, Numu. Obviously, not going to be necessary for Viera if you're using anything with Blood Price, but if you're trying to use other stuff with other jobs, it's not a bad option to keep them supported. Then, you know, you have the ability to deal some damage at range or put, like, regen and protect, or I think whatever the permutations of the different abilities are. Like, it lets you stack up on two different beneficial status effects at the same time, which kind of balances out for the fact that you have to take a turn to prime it. But you do still have to take a turn to prime it, and a job that can't move around and react to the battlefield compared to other jobs can be iffy. I don't think I can really put it any higher than B tier. Having mana restoration is nice because spells are so important in FFTA too, but the fact that you need to prime, that brings it down a notch for sure. Juggler is a very solid damage dealing, kind of debuffing job, just like it is in FFT, having the ability to disable, provide quicken, etc., etc. It's basically exactly the same as it was in FFTA. Like, if you want to have a physical-oriented job, then it's not a bad option for Moogles. Gadgeteer is still garbage. It is just literally just still sucks. It's still just putting fate in the hands of the dice roll, and you don't want that because it can screw you over really, really bad. Like, there's just better options for any sort of support. You don't want Gadgeteer whatsoever. And Fusilier, I think, still sits solidly in B tier. It gives you decent ranged damage. It does let you target specific elements, which can be more important in FFTA too. You can still get stop shot and things like that. It's one of the better options to leave a Moogle in, but it's still not really the best either. Finally, we have Chocobo Knight, and Chocobo Knight's also going to go in D tier. It's another one of these gimmick classes like Morpher was back in FFTA, where you're relying so specifically on what monsters you're finding, but this time it's just Chocobos. You have to find the thing, you have to weaken it enough that you can then mount it, and then you only get its abilities. Like, yeah, you can equip whatever gear you want on a Chocobo Knight, but their stats suck, and you just wind up being stuck. You're not learning anything, you're not equipping anything new. It's just like, what's the best gear I can get, and what's the most convenient Chocobo I can find, and that's just what this character does now. It's so boring, and honestly, it's kind of antithetical to the way that FFT A and A2 are meant to play. Even FFT, where you're learning new abilities, you're learning new jobs, you're unlocking new things, and like build crafting with it. And it's anti-build crafting. It's just, it sucks. Realistically, I should have had an F tier just so I could have put Chocobo Knight in F tier. But anyway, Moogle class is generally disappointing, but they have their utility when and where you can find it. Now we're into the last few options here with the Seek. And then the Gria. Now, these are interesting. It's always a bit of a shame that these new races only have 4 jobs apiece, but the jobs that they do have can be very interesting. Now, unfortunately, we are starting off with the weakest of the options here with Viking for Seek, which sounds super cool on the surface, like, oh, a melee axe-wielding job that also has access to, like, lightning magic, but also it's like a thief, it can steal stuff. That's super cool. The issue is it's a very limited job. Like, yeah, you can hit decently hard in melee, but the other Seek jobs hit way harder in melee. Yeah, you can cast thunder magic and stuff, but Seek suck with magic. Like, you don't really want to be casting anything with them. Oh, there's a cool, like, unique water ability with Tsunami that can hit a big area, but you have to be standing in water to use it, so most maps aren't even going to have that be something you can use at all. And then the maps that you can, it's generally going to be pretty limited on when you're going to be able to get your Seek to the water. Is there going to even be a target in range to use it on? It's kind of very situational, which is never a great option. And then their ability to deal damage and steal stuff sounds nice on paper, but the damage output is kind of weak with the plunder skills. The success rate of stealing things is worse than just trying to outright steal things with thieves. And if you fail and then try to steal again, your chances of stealing are actually lowered compared to the first time. So it's like, why all these limitations? Like, you have so many different cool options here. For how long it takes to be able to get Seek and then get the job unlocked, you'd think it would have a little bit more punch. But it doesn't, and unfortunately, that means it's going to sit solidly in C tier for Seek. Now, Rangers, on the other hand, we're rocketing all the way up to S tier. Ranger is so dumb because of item lore and reverse items. Want to insta-kill something with a Phoenix down? Boom, you got it. Want to deal 400 damage to something with perfect accuracy with an item lore reverse X potion? Boom, you got it. Want to be able to set up traps that burn enemy turns and deal damage to them or charm them or whatever, like have a battlefield tactician role going on? Boom, you got it. Want to have knives that are decent melee options or bows for a ranged option? Boom, you got it. You want to have equivalent move range and jump range to Viera assassins? Boom, you got it. Like, Seek are nuts with the ranger job. It's so insane. Like, just item lore as an ability combined with reverse item means that they're chemists from FFT on steroids. Like, they're able to insanely heal your team while also insanely poisoning the enemy and having battlefield control through traps. They're a ton of fun. It's the type of inspiration that I'd like to see kind of backfilled into FFT Reborn when that inevitably happens, to give chemists some more options, while maybe having it not be quite as busted as Seek Ranger is, because my god, Seek Ranger is disgusting. Next up, we have Seek Berserker, and I think this is a solid B-tier job. It's one of the, I think actually the starting job for Seek, now I think about it. And it's a good melee bruiser. Like, it's got very good physical damage. It's pretty fragile, as you might expect from something with no armor that's just trying to run in and punch stuff. But it runs in and punches stuff real good. Like, you want to be able to actually really hit enemy stats while also dealing with their gear. Berserker's got you. You want to be able to deal AoE damage. Good AoE damage, Berserker's got you. Sacrifice your own HP to be able to deal damage to enemies, Berserker's got you. Like, it's a very solid single target damage job in a game where by the time you get access to Seek, you're probably building into as much AoE spells as you can. So it kind of is held back in that regard, but what it does very well. Finally, we have Lanista, and this might be a little bit of personal bias here because I love the interplay of light and dark, a sort of Dark Knight aesthetic going on, but Lanista is really, really cool. Using your HP to fuel attacks, being able to drain that damage back off of enemies, having access to dark and light abilities while also dealing good melee damage and having access to good abilities and equipment overall. I think the Lanista is definitely a very strong option for Seek. It's not going to be anywhere near as busted as Rangers are, obviously, but if you're not looking to abuse the abilities that Ranger has and you're looking for more of just like a battlefield support and damage option, Lanista are definitely going to be good. Like, the fact that you can actually buff up your allies while also dealing big damage with like life drain, life sacrifice abilities, and have access to dark and light elements, which are not the most common. Like, they're there, but when they're useful, they're really useful, and having it on a melee job is really nice. So Lanista has a good versatility to it. That means that it's good in a lot of different scenarios. Finally, we have the Gria classes, the Flying Dragon Girls, and Gria are interesting as the only flying race in the game, and that gives them props just across the board, and all of their jobs do have a decent level of versatility. Right now, we're starting off with the Ravager. Ravager is a very interesting job just for its raw damage potential, and just sneak attack, I think, makes this an A tier job. Now, again, it's hard to reach S tier without having some just game-breaking bullshit or insane, like, AoE spell capabilities, but having the ability to deal massive single-target damage with sneak attack from attacking from behind, with a job in a race that can fly over terrain and very easily get behind enemies, makes for a very powerful combo. Combine that with the fact that they have good AoE physical attacks and the ability to really heavily damage opponents with other types of attacks, makes Ravager a pretty nasty option, especially since they wield greatswords. Now, you can compare that to Raptor, which is a little bit more like the Gria's version of Soldier and Warrior, but I think it's a bit better than Soldier and Warrior for two main reasons. First of all, it's able to fly. Second of all, it's able to deal damage while it's crushing enemy stats, which is exactly what I want Knights to be able to do in FFT. If you saw my Fixing Knights video that I put out a little while ago, that's one of the things that I mentioned. If you're gonna break enemy stats, to make it more worthwhile, you want to still be dealing some damage as well. Because otherwise, if you're breaking their stats, just kill them. Like, you know how much speed you have if your character is downed? 0. You know how much power you have if your character is downed? 0. So often you'd rather just be dealing damage, especially with so many high damage nuke options in A2. If you're going to be bothering with nerfing enemy stats, at least chunking them for some damage is definitely going to be the way to go. Then Gria does get Hunter, and I think it's pretty much B tier. And funny enough, the ability to fly really doesn't help it that much. Like, you can get to higher vantage points more easily than you can with Hume Ranger / Hunter, but not Ranger, that's the Seek class Hunter. But that doesn't help as much as you would expect. And overall, it doesn't really synergize that well with the other Gria abilities. Like, having the ability to sneak attack from range with a bow is nice, but your overall damage output is just going to be better on a Ravager anyway with a greatsword than it's going to be with a bow. So I think this is just going to sit in B tier for the same reasons that Hunter is in B tier, and we don't really have to think about it too much beyond that. Finally, we have Geomancer, and famously, I really like Geomancer in FFT, and fortunately, Gria Geomancer does have some of that same capability. A lot of their spells will be reliant on what tiles you're standing on to get different elemental effects and potentially have different debuffs. However, half of their skills also rely on what the actual weather conditions are on the battlefield that you're on, and that's basically completely random. Like, you have no say over that whatsoever. So you wind up forced into a situation where you might want to be able to use a particular ability because of the damage type or the status effect that it inflicts, and you just can't because of what the weather is doing, and you can't change what the weather is doing. So you kind of get stuck in these situations where it's like, well, I can use the basic single target spells that rely on what terrain I'm standing on, which is already limiting to a certain degree, or I can use the more powerful AoE ability that may not be the element or the debuff that I want because of the type of weather. So it's like, Then they use staves. They don't even use swords, so your physical damage is going to be weird. And they don't even, like, their magic's growth is not great. Like, Raptors have better magic growth than Geomancers. So if you want to have an effective Geomancer, you want to level them primarily in Raptor to get the best magic growth. It's like, it's weird, man. It's a really weird job. It's nowhere near as good as it is in FFT. I think it's pretty much C tier. Like, if you're going to be using a Gria, you probably want to be in Raptor or Ravager. And there we have it. I tried to go as quickly as I could through this. It's still going to be a long one. It's still going to take a lot of editing, but I feel pretty good about how this list is set up. Unsurprisingly to me, the primary dominant classes and jobs are going to be the ones that are able to make the most of big AoE magic damage, especially stuff that can make the most use of either Blood Price or Magic Frenzy. Paravir for just its insane single target damage, especially with things like Geomancy, deserves a slot there as well. But yeah, spells are the name of the game in FFT A2. You know, to say nothing of Ranger, which kind of exists by its own rules because of the way it just deals guaranteed damage and all that type of stuff with item lore and reverse items. So A2 does feel like a pretty well-balanced game, all things considered. It just knows that it wants you to lean into spells by the end of the game. But I think that's fine. Like, knowing where it wants you to go and then having those options be balanced while still having other less optimal jobs and abilities still be good is a pretty okay place for any sort of tactics or strategy game to wind up, in my opinion. And it does give you a lot of really cool options, far more versatility than you had in FFT, which I think is exactly what you want from a sequel. Refine and hone what existed previously while giving you new options to play with that still fit in that sandbox. And A2 does that very, very well. So let me know your thoughts on this tier list in the comments. I'm sure many of you already have been. If I absolutely shafted your favorite job, or if there's some insane combo that I completely forgot about, let me know all of that, your opinions on it, or correct me about anything in the comments. I love the discussions on these tier list videos. They lead to a lot of fun. And thank you to everyone who's been supporting the channel time and time again by watching these videos, directly supporting the Patreon, YouTube memberships, leaving comments, all that type of stuff. It makes it all a whole hell of a lot easier and worth doing because it takes a lot of time and effort even just to do a tier list video like this. So with that said, I'm going to wrap this one up here. My name has been Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. It's getting dark, so apologies for the blue filter on the camera. I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there. And remember, be good to each other, everybody. Bye now.